Some German presents Paper and Steel, a Dragon Age short story written by Joanna Berry, read by Lucas N.R. His blade hit the Chevalier mark exactly at the wrong angle and clicked. Damn, Samson groaned as the enemy sword whistled over his head, turning his arm in his way, changing the Chevalier's full strength. The blow shocked Samson's enemy, but the armor built by our legion, glistening like an artificial smile with embossed steel roses, had the greatest impact. The Chevalier kept his foot and let Samson use his power. Facing the enemy, Samson stared at the well-nourished, aristocratic features. The mustache was waxed and the skin pulverized, thanks to which sweat and stench did not sense this sensitive nose. The Chevalier, younger and stronger, began to push him away. When he arrived in slippery mud, Samson picked up his big word on a broken handle and drove him to the side of a man in which his fancy stitching on his chest did not match. The Chevalier drowned and lowered Samson's hand as if he was drowning. Samson snatched the mountain and buried it in the knight's throat. The blood drained and the peeling steel roses turned red. When the Chevalier fell, Samson already turned with a bloodied needle and searched the battlefield through the eyes of his general. Those open fields near Montfort offered little cover. The bus was nearby, but they didn't make it on time. There was nowhere to mention fatigue and confusion in the battle, and invented the folded paper bird that spread its wings, was thrown into a muddy puddle and was trampled on. Samson blinked with a clean head. His temples were there, in one piece. Suzanne ran a short sword through the squirrel and had the same expression with which she twisted the needle. Nearby was a young Whiston, a sandy-haired boy, skillfully dressed in grey, bearded chevalier. Before he helped Samson, the Stanner sword flashed and grabbed Chevalier's hand, which was clad with a steel pistol, before cleaning his wrist. Elsewhere, someone's tears died down, and the silence died down. It is over. Samson took a deep breath and removed his helmet. It was not prepared and powdered. His dark brown hair was wrinkled on his scalp and his face was thick. His old armor, which he wore like a robber, wore charm and was a rose. But he and his temples lived, while the polished Orlesian occupiers, the leaders of the suspect patrol, did not live at their feet. Samson looked down, hands folded and sighing. "Come on, it was good Kirkwall's steel," he murmured. Still, Maddox can do something about it. Samson raised his sword and threw grass at the Orlesian monument. His soldiers immediately gathered in perfect discipline, just like the temples of the Order once did. But now her obedience was not associated with bloody singing, and lithium forced her to slip her neck. Young recruiters and veterans, both men and women, united them for one purpose: better than any invisible player. They were also connected by something else, and it would be better to see how everyone met after that. They both had strange reddish eyes that revealed their source of strength. "Damn Chevalier," Samson said, walking in rows to check on the wounded. "I can't keep them alive long enough to teach them a lesson." His temples smiled. He walked over to the young Vlan, who was leaning on his sword and breathing heavily. There was no blood visible. "Did he throw you in the ribs, Whiston?" "No, I'm fine, cheese. A little windless. I can walk." Samson looked at him. "Everyone says that when it begins," an eloquent voice whispered in his head. "They don't want to shoot you." "Well, try to keep up," Samson told him. "Take luggage and come back." Suddenly he felt thirsty, and more than water. The camp was in a quiet, tree-lined mountain range far above Montfort, where the eastern wind smelled of salt and peat from Nahashin swamps. Soon they were to march to the Theronfall editorial office, but now it was calm and safe. Samson talked to the guards and led his team inside, washed away the worst sweat, and then began to circulate. The camp was built on a large clearing with fresh stumps here and there. The tents rang in the middle fire, where rabbits and roasted pork dripped sheep fat in flames. Each soldier, Samson, greeted him with respect. Some wore robes or accessories, others worked as bells, cooked or trained. On the small hill above the camp, the hammers from the tent sounded like patients were dropping water. Maddox was tired. He felt like any other military camp, but Samson passed a slim woman who carried hundreds of weights without sweat on the post. And when the man hit his freshly polished dagger with his thumb, he didn't fit. They were afraid, Samson thought proudly when he nodded to everyone and saw a red, glowing eye. Kurand never knew what he had. A tent guarded by two of its best and most reliable soldiers passed. His eyes were directed forward. From the inside, Samson had faint red gloss. Fluid was poured into the bowels when a soothing voice spoke. Red was the source of the power of his temple's people. These chevaliers saw his power and called it monsters, as if they were not even human. Same crap, different day. Samson has heard much of the same story about burned temples, or people like Maddox, or Magician, all because Chantry scared people. But all the Chantra mistakes go home. At the end of the circle, Samson noticed a familiar figure near the fire. Wisdom sat on a tree trunk, wrapped in a blanket, and trembled despite the constant heat. Samson frowned and grabbed the hand of the passing companion, then pointed to Wisdom. Boy there, check if he ate dinner. If he doesn't eat it, do it for him. Suddenly, General. Samson purposely turned away from the heat of the camp, and walked under the trees in the thick darkness. There was a poor path that he would now walk without light. The bird got stuck there once or twice. Finally, Samson heard a heavy, suffocating breath and turned to him without fear. He stopped when he reached the plump face, each red as Chinese, and his eyes glowed early in the starlight. Samson spoke to them calmly but surely, and they responded. The general is looking after his soldiers, Samson said, even if some sleep in a different camp. Even if he has to look at their faces. Samson returned to the camp and went straight to his personal tent. It was dark and damp inside. His bunk was barely sleeping. Documents, cards, reports, props were on a nearby desk. The empty bottle rang on her shoe when she flexed her chest. She took her things, overlooked and threw her chest in frustration, then began to dig through several clothes, looked under the table, and there. A small vial of dimly red liquid appeared under his bunk, where it was rolled up. The sight alone made the throat and intestines feel worse. Samson lay flat and reached out under the bunk. The vial took several attempts before it could be torn off and spilled. It wasn't like drinking water. Bitter liquid ran down the tongue like syrup and seemed to flow straight into the bone. Samson sat on the floor, leaning against the bunk as strength and warmth rose in him, a force that apparently always existed. The soft sounds of the hammer from Maddox's tent turned to crystal clear air. His breath and heartbeat were their own harmony. A small dose of red lyria always soothed Samson's nerves. The entire vial immediately calmed his soul. Without waving, he could think of protrusions or faces in the woods. The camp noise was outside. The two guards talked near the tent opening, and the oily red of their eyes was bright. Then they went further. Samson sat down a little and looked at the vial he weighed in his hand. A few ruby drops of precious lithium sticks inside. He picked up the vial and shook the drops in his mouth. Every day my dear mother gave tailors in Kirkwall the opportunity to advertise their poetry. Blue poetry. In a small room with Andrew's face. Recruiters, like sheep, drank it undeniably because they loved the creator, or because they wanted to earn or trust broadcasters. At first it seemed like a real blessing. Lithium removed your fear and left your strength in place. But like any power, it created addiction. At least the red said, shifts. Chantry lithium. You have never noticed that it will take a moment, painless more than fear, until you wake up one day and do without things. Samson pulled an empty vial out of his hand. The commander of the Holy Knight, Meredith, accidentally threw her out of the temple after lithium attachment and ordered her to drink. What if the rules are lost? He had his reasons, and this ruined city needed all possible help. It didn't matter. In any case, the woman was knocked out on the streets of Kirkwall to endure the horrors of lithium removal itself. Maybe it was best. After all, preaching, poetry, and lies have brought less than people. Chantry can also have black animated costumes for the dirty work. Magician. Armor. My sword, Samson said, patting his feet. He had forgotten a broken blade before. It was better to think about it than in the past. Samson found the package in which he held the broken blade, put it on his shoulder, and headed for the lonely tent above the camp. The hammer blows were still ringing. It was late, but Maddox rarely slept. It was surprisingly cool in the tent, although the lithium forge shone in the corner. The soot stains on the canvas created frightening patterns and smelled of sweetly evaporated lithium and smoke. Samson walked past the shelf, wearing mysterious tools of the size, drinks and essences and rare dusts. Clear through, 3 books with songs on the cover. On one side there was a leather plug under a wooden doll covered with the beginning of a coat. Breastplate, gloves, fat, all made to measure Samson. The armor was made of stainless steel, but the heavy red lithium protrusions folded into metal showed what the steel was molten from. It smelled of hot iron and old blood. Samson paused and reached for his breastplate. His temple-trained mind sensed the power of sleep. When the time came, he knew that buying weight would be like dipping into molten glass, red, an ocean of pain whose strength is second to none. He smiled at the armor and argued about her. His temples survived their own trials. It was Samson's. It will endure how they did it, and survive and become new. Nothing worth it was free. Maddox worked on the anvil and reached for a white sweatshirt and leather apron, hands in non-sparkling materials. For years, when Samson knew him, he passed from a cozy young man to an experienced craftsman. Now a new piece of this armor formed under his arms, consisting of steel and crystals that melted effortlessly. Samson dropped his backpack. Evening. Maddox looked over his shoulder. He had a narrow, delicate face and calm eyes like a deer. Her dark hair was heavily cut, so the sunstroke marked her forehead. "Hi, Samson. I hope you're okay." Maddox watched Samson unpack, but continued to work. He could pretend with his eyes closed, and even when he slammed his fist on his hand, Samson knew that if he didn't apologize for breaking his fingers, because they had time to heal, he wouldn't give a signal. It was so quiet. "You must forge to get the sword," Samson said, pulling out pieces. With the help of pliers, Maddox placed the finished armor element and took the broken size with both hands. "I see myself bending here and here," he hit with great force. "It worked," said Samson. "Still, it's a decent Kirkwall blade, too good for scrap. See what you can do about it." Samson looked around the tent with his little child. "You did it for a minute or two, didn't you?" Maddox looked up. "Oh no. I have to hide the broken ends so that they connect before I can weld enough forging. Next—" "A joke, Maddox," Samson said quietly. "Oh." Maddox thought about it, then laughed obediently and methodically, and made Samson start. Fortunately, Tranquil re-examined the broken sword when Samson found himself at the end of the barrel, and enjoyed the strong smell of lithium vapor in the air. What Chantry did to his stamps was unforgivable, but what he did to Maddox was disgusting. While Samson was still in the good of the books of the Order, he was a magician at Kirkwall Circle. Gallow, the ugliest name of the prison. Maddox was not a great shiver of magicians, but his parents were swordsmen, and Maddox did things forever in the gallows workshop. Pieces of metal, a fancy prick, and a new addition to Samson's broken bun that smiled to correct the curve. "If you ever need merit," Samson told him when no one was listening, "let me know." One day Maddox Samson came up with red ears, holding a typewriter roll and smiling. "For my girlfriend, Kirkwall. Would you take them?" Then Samson occasionally tries to take the damn things with him. Sometimes he preferred mountains, small orders. Sometimes with lithium vials for sweetening. However, there was a risk crossing the border. But with each sentence of letters, Maddox would lay a bird. Its wings were spread like gulls drifting in the wind near the tall windows of Gallows. Under Meredith, freedom was a cruel dream in the mountains of Kirkwall Circle. They often sat in the cells, watching the temples day and night, who were told that every step in a row was suspicious. All these young looks told us that magic is a curse, that it is dangerous, and that it must stay inside and look through the windows all her life. Some went crazy. Others, crazy or not, tried to jump. First of all, there was a paper bird made by someone whose dreams of freedom and the hand of her friend were not completely dead. Proof of humanity, when the ring and song simply wanted their friends to obey. So Samson accepted Maddox's letters. Finally, Commander Knight Meredith spoke. He used this as an excuse to get Samson out of the order and claimed to prove that he had become disordered and seriously lyrical. Recent letters were dropped and crushed when they joined him at Meredith's office. Samson found new life in the Kirkwall gutter when the beggar lacked lyrium. From time to time he helped young climbers to escape, but Maddox was accused of hurting the temple, which is a serious charge. Meredith was ruthless. He changed the emotionless transit of Maddox thanks to the lithium brand. Maddox would no longer dream of the horizon and say nothing about his joy or make his little paper birds. They retained their skills without being treated as human beings, which seemed to be the natural endpoint of every Chantra bloody act. When Meredith finally clicked and Kirkwall caught fire, Simpson chased Maddox. No one could do anything for him, but his life had more to offer. Surviving temples tried to restore peace in the city. To suppress the memories of the rebels, someone had to wear a sword of mercy, even broken bracelets. Samson tried to help, but what did he have to do? Just forget that he now saw things from both sides, from the pillows and the gutter. Under the pressure of control loops, wizards like children whom Samson once gladly helped to cast out of demons. The first wizard, Orsino, whom Samson kindly remembered, went crazy as far as possible. And the temples of his brother and sister? The Kirkwall chapter was under Meredith's bolts so long that they knew something wrong. All Meredith was at war with people who controlled the magic and were afraid that the temples would also raise their fears. Fear only grew when the young knight, Captain Cullen, left the city to look at Chantra's interests. Kirkwall temples fell without new orders. There was no relief. Every day there were more and more reports about the Mage's rebellion and how the little temples fight him. When they heard it, Samson felt the blood and smoke of war because Chandra's impossible requirements for mountains and temples tore the world to shreds. One evening, Samson went with a hanged man while his lily of the valley was dry and slept in Maddox's shelter. On the other side of the cup, he noticed a dwarf with strange eyes nearby. The dwarf smiled at someone upstairs asking for Samson's name. Curious, Samson left behind the cheerful sound of the bar, climbed the dark stairs, almost empty, and found a figure staring into the niche of the fireplace. At first he thought the stranger was wearing grey guard armor, but the figure seemed to change as she entered. She became larger, deformed, and had a powerful aura of magic. Samson drew his sword full of temple instincts, but the stranger stood patiently until Samson left him. He felt cold eyes stare at her. Then the stranger said, "This place is unknown to me. Explain clearly, what is the Templar?" And Samson realized he didn't have the right answer. Someone who protected the mountains? Currently, half of the order has created a sword, or worse. Maddox was broken and a great pastor tapped Meredith on the wrist. Chantry soldier. The temples suffered magical horrors on behalf of the Chantra, disgust, demons, bloodshed. And what did they get? Pat on the head and lily for nightmares. So the night of the producer? But what did a just and loving creator make this temple suffer in this way? Samson's interrupted prayers at these long, painful endings ceased. "The order deserved better," he said aloud. "We trusted them. We deserve more than just use until we wash their mind." His anger boiled close to the surface. "They treat us like animals. Your temples." The stranger picked up the lithium vial and glowed red instead of blue. Samson watched it from the side and remembered the end of Meredith and the power he gave. "If you could tear him away from the roots of the emerging Chantra," asked the stranger, "place a new order, what price would you be willing to pay?" "If there was a better clue than the temple than mine," Samson said, "I would spill my own blood for her. But I burned it a long time ago. You're asking the wrong man." "I don't think so," the stranger replied, pulling Samson out of the vial, as simple as giving him a paper bird. Then everything began to change. Samson paid the price of a stranger he would pay forever, but he knew what he was buying. Like many other like-thinking temples, for the rest of the order, Samson examined his guilt and accepted it. If that meant a world where the Chantry crimes could never happen again, so be it. And when you get to that core, Samson was on fire. Her day was over, or so he thought. But this stranger, full of true wisdom and power, who not only stared at the invisible figure, saw everything in Samson's heart. If he could choose the perfect, pious recruitment, Then Samson was again ordered by a stranger, an army that could stop everything. Samson understood a few things. First, the soldiers will continue to go where they go. He never asked the temple to do something that he would not have done himself, which was the beginning. With a steady supply of lithium, he thought, the focus became sharp and he was able to rediscover his strategy. Samson kept up the changes he saw in Meredith and his soldiers, but these changes never came, not for him. The stranger talked about the protection his magic could offer, but when Samson drank red, he felt the stranger follow him curiously. Over time, this brought another example. Now that Samson had as much lithium as he wanted, he could clearly see the doses needed. Bad suspicion grew as he held the ruby vials in the light. What if her addiction was greater than she thought? What if he started somehow resisting poetry and not its weaknesses? Or was it another salvation for his pride? What if now he was never sure again? But even the idea and enthusiasm entrusted to him forced him to rise again, march on top of the temples and wave to them. He would lead them to the glorious end wherever they were. Samson did not disappoint, and he wasn't lost, was selected. Now Samson looked at the serious, captivating man who had suffered in those dark places next to him. "Do you ever think of the old days, Maddox, Kirkwall, Meredith, or a pillow?" Maddox stuck the lithium fuel in the hammer, arranging the pieces. "Hi, I don't dream or regret it." Samson laughed slightly. "Then peace will be happy for something." "But then I could think about it when I needed it. Do you need me for this?" Samson looked at the doll's red and shiny armor and shook his head. "Maybe you're better. I doubt if Stahl wants to remember the forge where he came from." "I prefer it here," Maddox said. "It's calm. I can focus on my work." He paused. "Samson, application. It's harder to work when the camp is loud." Samson just said that when he heard the screams and screams outside. He could move the tent further. He quickly pushed the tent aside and ran to the camp. His wild eye caught fire on a blanket where he was thrown into the fire. The young Vistana temple shook her companions in an open circle and knocked on everyone for a moment. There was a dripping sword in his hand, and the hollow sound of his throat was inhuman. The cook who opposed the fire fed his torn and bloody side. Samson's neck hair pierced them like needles. He saw his madness against his temples, but never so fast. Sprowan was snoring and stabbing the others. 3 temples piled on both sides, pulling weapons to bring him down. Wisdom knocked down 2, and the third, the head of the camp, stumbled with his own eyes and reached for a terrible gauze. "Leave it to me." Samson casually pushed through the crowd and saw Wisdom. The red glow in her eyes shone. "Stop, Stan," he commanded. Stannon groaned unevenly. A reddish glow spilled over his teeth, the nails of his hand that gripped his sword. And then Samson noticed that he had slipped out of Meadow's tent without gun or helmet. The free hand in his head hurt as he shook. Samson was left behind, but the young recruiter was well trained. Wisdom turned and would twist Samson's neck if he didn't leave immediately. Samson jumped to his feet and remembered the night battles of the streets of Kirkwall and strangers as the thieves smashed the city center and moved like nightmares. But it wasn't a dream. This boy was in his temple to protect him. "We tasted red," Wisdom said again, knitting like a snake. "You gave it to us. We will be more. Fight for a new world. That is what you wanted." "But let yourself be tested," said Samson. 2 were circling with their eyes closed. "A man uses his strength. I don't use it. It was chanterelle tea. That's what we took a lily. Do you remember?" The sound coming from Samson's ears like a challenge to a demon. The calmer voice of the circling soldier said, "I'm sorry, Samson." She waved a finger and wrapped the end of the skin around the claws tightly. Samson looked at Maddox's emotional face of the light in the fire, before Wisdom fled furiously and flashed his own sword. Samson solved the stroke. Wisdom pressed him and they collided. Without a shadow, Samson's grip was uncomfortable, but he could throw and knit like a bee trying to drop a needle. When Wisdom turned his head, Samson drew a drunk text, pulled back his empty hand and stabbed him with unnatural force. A red spark appeared after the impact. The boy choked but did not let go of the sword. Instead he lurked because he killed. Samson picked up the broken blade and threw his stick-out sword up down. The cut that should hit Samson's eye blurred over his shoulder. Samson took a risk and tapped him on the forehead. He saw stars and something crunching, but Wisdom pulled away. The boy stumbled. Drops of blood flew to hay. Samson put his knee on his chest and put his blade on Ulla's throat. "Can you feel it? Do you feel the steel on your neck? Chantry did it. He poisoned us and then made us mad marble." He pressed harder for a second, knowing he could kill the boy. It could end with what was to come before it even began. Then he lowered the blade. "And that's what we do, because we choose control, because we burn everything before we let Chandra take another temple." Sprawan went limp. The red glow in her eyes was softer now. "He made me choke." Jeez, I... Samson knelt down, grabbed Eximban's arm and pulled him up. "Sometimes it takes that," he said. "The trick is not to rule." Samson raised the Templar's voice over them. "Let this be a lesson to many of you. We will lose this dark world and rebuild it. There is blood there and most of us belong to us." Hardened his tone. "Some of you are changing, maybe something outrageous, but you are invincible. We must be monstrous. Do you think the world is changing because you're asking it nicely? For too long we have been fighting the beast that is beautiful Theda's claws. We need the same ruthlessness. Forging a sword you need a fire and an anvil. Is it not worth the sacrifice? How much does your heart and soul cost? Do you have the right to be your own?" Someone started clapping. Others have joined. Samson raised his voice and boomed loudly in the dark to those who heard the whole camp and drew their broken sword into the sky. "A red storm is coming." The greeting changed into a song from all sides. "New world, new god, a red storm is coming." Maddox gave up his second job and worked late into the night to forge Samson's sword. It had to be done carefully. This edge would once again save Samson's life. He was General Maddox and his friend. Everything must be fine. It was practical for the blade not to suffer further damage during the Templar stand. Like the temples, it would survive to be passed. The sword was forged at night and a piece of metal remained. Maddox looked at it and remembered talking to Samson in Kirkwall last night and the life he once lived. Nothing was wasted. He took the scrap iron into the tweezers, warmed it thoroughly, dealt a sharp blow to the anvil and extinguished it. He laid his work on a table near the scales, a small bird with outstretched wings, and forged in steel. That is the end of Paper and Steel, a Dragon Age short story, written by Joanna Berry, read by Lucas N.R.